Hi everyone, it's March the 18th and here I am at school in an empty classroom, which is very, very strange. Good to be with you. We are going to be reading another installment of The Captain's Dog. This time I'm starting on page 94. If you remember, the last journal entry was in November, but this journal entry starts on January the 12th, 1805. And Lewis says in his journal, "We brought in the new year by taking a large group of men to the first Mandan village for dancing and merriment. A good time was had by all." It's a short journal entry. So here we go with the dog's point of view now. "We enjoyed our time among the Mandans, but after a few weeks, the men were already talking about proceeding on, hoping for an early spring. I was eager to leave as well. I had gotten used to wandering and discovering new sights and smells. The fort was secure and comfortable, but also confining. I spent a good part of each day roaming through the Mandan villages or out hunting with Drouillard. Captain Lewis spent most days inside the fort, working on his notes and preparing his collection, which would be sent back with the French voyageurs in the spring. As the winter progressed, food became scarce. Our hunters often came back hungry and frostbitten, without a scrap of meat to show for their efforts. The captains started doctoring the Indians in exchange for meat and produce. They treated wounds, colds, rheumatism, bad teeth, frostbite, and a number of other ailments. The word spread, and every morning a dozen Indians lined up outside the captain's huts, each with an armful of food to wait for their turn for white medicine. A second business was set up using the forge and the blacksmith and gunsmith skills of Private John Shields. The Indians brought in hoes that needed mending, axes that needed sharpening, and broken rifles. Eventually, there wasn't a broken hoe in any of the Mandan and Hidatsa lodges. The axes were all sharpened, and all the Indians' rifles were as good as new. Business dropped off. The captains remedied this by helping Shields design a battle axe, an item that became so popular he and the men helping him could hardly keep up with the demand. I thought Shields' axe business was a little odd. On the one hand, the captains were telling the Indians to stop warring with one another. On the other hand, they were making battle axes that the Indians would certainly use in raids. One day, a Hidatsa war chief stopped by the captain's hut, but on his way, I'll say that one again. One day, a Hidatsa war chief stopped by the captain's hut on his way to pick up a battle axe at the forge. He asked permission to raid the Sioux and Arikaras when the weather broke in spring. He got the axe, but was told not to use it, which I could see made no sense to him. Here we are in February the 11th, 1805. Lewis says, "Sacagawea began her labor today. Captain Clark and I are attending her, but the birth is taking an inordinate amount of time. I have grown very fond of her since she and her husband moved into the fort with us." And then the dog's point of view. The captain wasn't alone in his feelings for Bird Woman. Soon after she and Charbonneau moved into the fort, she announced that she was pregnant. There was some heated debate among the men over the wisdom of her joining our tribe. They thought a woman with a child would be too much of a burden, but as they got to know her, the subject began to fade. There was something about her quiet shyness that appealed to all the men, and by the time she gave birth, they were looking forward to having a human pup on the journey. Bird Woman spent many evenings picking burrs out of my fur, and from time to time she slipped me a dead mouse because she knew I was partial to them. These two acts of kindness were more than enough to endear her to me forever. Bird Woman's labor was long. The captains fretted over her as if they were the expectant fathers, not Charbonneau. After a time, René Jassom, one of the French traders living with the Mandans, suggested to Captain Lewis that he feed her a bit of rattlesnake rattle to hurry the labor along. "It works every time," René insisted. Captain Lewis was doubtful, but he was getting desperate. He broke up a bit of rattlesnake rattle, put it into a cup of water, and offered it to her. Sure enough, a few minutes after she drank the mixture down, our tribe had a new member. They named the pup Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, but Captain Clark called him Pomp. which is the name that seemed to stick. About a month after Pomp was born, Charbonneau and his family got kicked out of the fort. The problem began when the captain sat down with Charbonneau to go over his contract, and he became uppity with them. He told the captains he would not perform any camp duties, carry any loads, or stand guard duty. He also informed them that he expected to be free to leave the party at any time, and that they would have to supply him with provisions if he did. This, of course, was unacceptable, and he was asked to leave that very day. I just want to pause here for a moment because we have a vocabulary word coming up in this next little section. The word is guttural, and I'll read the paragraph 2 times so that you can get a context clue and do the vocabulary assignment for that word. The captains were very disappointed at this turn of events, and so were the men. The fort just wasn't the same without Bird Woman and Pomp. The men missed making faces and uttering odd, guttural sounds at her pup. I miss them too. Guttural is the vocabulary word. I'll read that paragraph one more time. The captains were very disappointed at this turn of events, and so were the men. The fort just wasn't the same without Bird Woman and Pomp. The men missed making faces and uttering odd, guttural sounds at her pup. I miss them too. A few days after their departure, I crossed the frozen river to the Mandan village where they were staying to see how they were doing in their new circumstances. Long before I reached the village, I heard Bird Woman's voice, but she sounded more like an angry bear than a bird. She was calling her husband every bad name she could think of in Shoshone and Hidatsa. At best, I could figure out, between curses, Bird Woman wanted to go home to her family below the big mountains and could not believe Charbonneau's arrogance had ruined this prospect. I did not hear Charbonneau utter a single word all during this harangue. The conversation was so one-sided, I thought she must have killed him, and she was shouting at his corpse, but I was wrong. The buffalo hide door of the lodge flew open, and he stumbled outside in a daze, with Bird Woman still shouting at him. Charbonneau found Tabot and begged him to go over to the fort and intercede with the captains on his behalf. He told Tabot that he would do anything the captains asked if they would just allow him and Bird Woman to go with them. Tabot crossed over to the fort and argued the case. The captains let Charbonneau stew for a few more days in Bird Woman's wrath, but they finally gave in and hired him back. Okay, this next journal entry is March the 30th, 1805, and this is by Captain Lewis again. Our preparations for departure are nearly complete, and within a week we will be on our way. Captain Clark and I have written a detailed letter to President Jefferson outlining our journey thus far. We will also be sending back the animal and plant collection and some of our notes. From this point on, we will be traveling into uncharted territory, but I am confident we will discover the Northwest Passage if what the Hidatsas have told us is true. We will be traveling in our 2 pirogues and in 6 dugout canoes the men have made, all of which have been rigged with sails. With these smaller boats, we should make 25 miles a day, arriving at the Pacific this summer, and perhaps even returning to Fort Mandan before winter. Captain Clark and I are confident in the 26 men we have chosen to continue on with us in the permanent party. We have organized the privates into 3 squads, with a sergeant over each squad. In addition, we travel with 5 civilians: York, Juilliard, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and Pomp. I am so eager to leave, I can barely sleep at night. And now we go back to what Siemens, the dog, has to say. Our final days at Fort Mandan were hectic, but at last the men were ready and the boats were loaded. The keel boat headed back down the Missouri toward St. Louis with the French voyageurs, and the men not assigned to the permanent party. On board were all of the captain's notes, the dead animal collection, 4 live magpies, a live prairie dog, a live prairie hen, and privates Reed and Newman. Remember, those were the 2 guys that had been court-martialed and they had to leave. After the long winter, Captain Lewis wanted to stretch his legs and decided to walk along shore. I led the way. We proceeded on. The men tired easily at first. The long winter at Fort Mandan had softened them, and the lack of meat had not helped matters. The Indians seemed to have killed nearly every animal for 100 miles, and the few our hunters managed to shoot were in poor flesh after the harsh winter. On most days I stayed on shore, foraging, unless the captain made me ride in the boat, which he seldom did. Sometimes I rambled by myself, sometimes with the captain, sometimes with the hunters, and sometimes with Bird Woman. Now I'm going to reread that last paragraph because we have another vocabulary word. The word is foraging. This is on page 102. On most days, I stayed on shore foraging unless the captain made me ride in the boat, which he seldom did. Sometimes I rambled by myself, sometimes with the captain, sometimes with the hunters, and sometimes with Bird Woman. So what do you think it means for a dog to go foraging? That's what you need to write in your context clue column. Okay, and carrying on. She walked with little Pomp strapped to her back on a cradle board, bundled in blankets and skins with only his little black eyes and nose exposed. On warm days, his arms were freed to play with his mother's black hair as she walked with her head down, looking for plants and roots and mice nests, which she found faster than I could smell them. When she discovered a nest, she opened it with a stick to retrieve the hog peanuts the mice had stored. I was more interested in the mice than the peanuts, but the rodents were so quick I was lucky to catch one out of every other nest. And Bird Woman didn't allow me to eat the pink baby mice. The first time I tried to snap one of the blind squirmers up, she whacked me a good one across the nose with her stick. Bad dog. It is wrong to eat babies that cannot run away. She always left a couple of peanuts in the nest for the mice to eat and covered the babies before she proceeded on. At night, the captain slept in a buffalo skin lodge along with Juilliard, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and Pomp. I slept nearest to the door so I could get out quickly if I heard something outside. Charbonneau snored louder than any man I have ever heard, which added to Captain Lewis's irritation with him. Before we left Fort Mandan, Charbonneau had assured the captains he was a skilled boatman, but it became clear that this was not true. I was in his boat one day with Captain Lewis, Sacagawea, Pomp, Juilliard, and 3 men who could not swim. A sudden squall came up, turning the boat sideways. Charbonneau sat at the tiller, frozen in fear, despite Captain Lewis's shouting at him to swing the bow into the current. The boat nearly sank with all of our trade goods, to say nothing of the men who could not swim. Juilliard, ever steady in the face of disaster, calmly lowered the sail, and the boat righted itself. If it were not for Sacagawea, I am sure the captains would have sent Charbonneau back to the Mandan village that afternoon. About this time, an Indian dog showed up in camp. I had smelled it following us for several days and hoped it had the sense not to show itself, but its hunger drove it into camp late one evening. It slunk into the firelight and flopped down right in front of me. Poor thing. Bones sticking out, open sores on the skin. Look, Seaman has a girlfriend. He could do better than that. Followed him all the way from the Mandan village. She was not a Mandan or Hidatsa dog. She had been out on her own for quite some time. Juilliard threw her scrap of beaver meat, but she didn't touch it, fearing I might attack her. I backed away to give her room, and she snapped up the meat and bolted back into the trees. Now that she had gotten a taste of food, I knew she would be back, and I hoped she wouldn't suffer the same fate as my prairie wolf. I had not seen Whitefeather since the fire on the Mandan prairie. Every time I heard a crow, I would run to the sound and was disappointed when I found the cawing came from a common crow. Okay, we're ending on page 105 for this session. Now I need you to go to your prediction sheet, and I need you to make a prediction about what is happening next. You should know that the next journal entry is just a month away from this one on April the 20th, 1805. Thanks. We'll be back again tomorrow. Bye.